So across the United States, we have been seeing this massive surge of political violence, harassment, attacks, intimidation against public officials. We usually only hear about it in prominent cases like the attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who was attacked in San Francisco. What we don't really hear about is that this is affecting people all the way down to the local level. It's affecting federal judges, it's affecting education workers, health workers, election workers. This growing acceptance is happening in both parties, and political violence experts say that's extremely dangerous given where we find ourselves now. I spoke to several experts in political violence about what's really driving this. They all mentioned that rhetoric, just in general, over the last couple of years, especially driven in the presidency of Donald Trump and by his supporters, the language of violence is being used more, and some people are taking it literally and seriously. And they also are saying that there's a growing acceptance of political violence as a tool. And they call this partisan moral disengagement. And what that means is that more and more people on both sides of the political aisle see the other party as evil. They see them as, less human. And this justifies, the possible use of force. Covering January 6th was such a shocking, unprecedented instance of political violence. But speaking to people on the ground, it really seemed like this was a much deeper problem that wasn't being covered. And so for the last year or two, we really started collecting examples all across the country to try to give people a good sense of the scope of this problem. That it's not just members of Congress or the president who have always been the target of death threats and even assassinations in the past, but really that even, your local city council official or your local retiree who happens to volunteer as an election worker, they are getting targeted, they are getting death threats. One of the biggest trends we've really seen during the pandemic was people showing up at officials' houses. And we saw this in New York, where a council member who supported masks for children under 5 in schools during a different stage of the pandemic had really angry constituents come. They were banging on his door. His family was inside. That was really scary for them. But that wasn't a one-off. We've seen that in a lot of different parts across the country. I spoke to the top health official in Alabama who ended up having to bring a bulletproof vest to events every time he was going to speak with members of the public. That's really stunning. That's a really large escalation. In Idaho, we saw this case of a man who was arrested after making violent threats against the mayor of Boise. He was found with bullets that said "Die McLean" on them, which is the name of the mayor, including a bunch of other things that made it look like he was serious about actually committing an attack. And he also belonged to an extremist anti-government group. And the mayor has been very public about the toll that this has taken on her family, about the fact that every time she hears a car pull up outside of her house, she's worried about her safety. And again, this is not an outlier. Many of these people think that they're outliers, but it's happening all across the country.
The surge in violent threats has targeted members of both parties. Congressman Lee Zeldin, the Republican nominee for New York governor, was attacked at a campaign rally this summer by a man with a sharp object. Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, got so many death threats after refuting Trump's allegations of voter fraud that his family had to leave their home and go into hiding.
Another category that never really faced this uptick before is education officials, school board members. There's been a lot of anger about critical race theory, about teaching about transgender equity, even about not banning certain books that they consider inappropriate for children. And that has made school board meetings very, ground zero for some very tense, sometimes violent confrontations.
But you don't like the Pledge of Allegiance because it hurts your little black feelings. Oh, you're a fascist Nazi, and now you are marked.
In many cases, what's happening is that this avalanche of threats is changing the ways that the government does its job, that these officials do their jobs. And it's gotten so bad that the Justice Department actually had to open a task force in order to really track and try to prosecute some of these death threats and cases against election workers. We spoke to a lot of people on the local level and on the state level who are having to invest their own resources in securing their home, hiring armed guards. They're having to install bulletproof glass in local government offices.
According to recent polls, many Americans expect the situation to get worse, with 64% saying the belief that political violence will increase going forward. But experts say the only thing that has proven successful to combat the surge of violent threats and targeted harassment is for political leaders to denounce it. With the 2024 election coming up, they say a lot will ride on how US leaders respond.